This is an exciting time in Scotland's story, and understanding our past will help us determine our future. And when Scotland's voice is heard, it charts the way forward. This is Scotland Speaks with Salmond.
Good morning and welcome to Scotland Speaks with Salmond here at the People's Palace in Glasgow at the usual time of 10 AM on your Saturday morning.
Which is For the Football. And For the Football, we're going to have time today to crowd in the fourth in our series about what Scotland might have looked like if we'd all voted for independence 10 years ago. We've done one on the economy and the social life of Scotland. We've done one on the politics of Scotland. And today it's Scotland in the international arena.
And who better to speak to than Joan McAlpine, former member of the Scottish Parliament and former chair of the External Affairs Committee in the Scottish Parliament at the pivotal time when Scotland was asked the question, should we be an independent country? But you can look forward to all of that. Before we turn to that and many other elements of today's show, can we say a huge thank you, first of all, to all of you who turned up at the Hope Over Fear rally, and to those of you who turned up to the great show at the IMAX Theatre in Glasgow Science Centre last weekend.
And it really was a packed Saturday. First of all, the rally in George Square, a bit of rain, but it certainly didn't dampen the spirits. And then to a packed IMAX Theatre, where in a Tasmina Ahmed Sheikh production of The Eyes Have It on tour, people gathered together to chart a way forward for Scotland.
So thank you to all of those who came to see the show and all of you who've asked if there'll be the opportunity to see it online, and luckily, yes there will, because we recorded the whole event, so you'll be able to watch it over the next couple of weeks only on Scotland Speaks with Salmond. Now in last week's show, which was part 3 in our 4-part series on what Scotland could have looked like if we'd voted for independence, we interviewed the amazing Rob McAlpine on what, from a social perspective, Scotland might have looked like 10 years from 2014. Here's some excerpts from that most excellent interview that took place just outside the Mary Barber statue in Govan. Over to Robin.
Now you've got a theory about the psychology of Scottish sporting sides. Are you really saying that the act of independence would make things easier for the football team or the rugby team or any team in Scotland?
Right, so if you're a sociologist, this is my background, you're going to discover that societies have a collective conscience. You get them. You get this sense of the stoicism of the Soviets or the gregariousness of the Italians, and there is a kind of collective attitude that we take. And the truth is, just now, I think Scotland expects to lose. We keep losing big company headquarters in Scotland. We keep losing sports matches we should win. We keep losing political challenges that we could easily have won. And I think we've got a bit of a mentality where we expect either to bottle it or that most Scottish of things, to put up a valiant fight but just fall short. And I think this comes from the colonialisation of our mind. I'm not going to get in a fight over whether Scotland's colonised or not, but our imagination is, by its nature. We are part of a bigger entity, which doesn't always follow the direction that we go. And I think that the simply slipping those bonds of looking over our shoulder to seeing what our big brother's doing all the time, I think it would take a monkey off our back. I think it would help us stop grasping at things and start to mature into a country that just does these sorts of things. So would we have won the European Championship? No, we probably wouldn't. Would we have spaced it with a goal in the last second? I'm hoping not. That's what I'm hoping, just for once. I'm not standing in a bar on my holidays, incidentally, with a lovely young Scottish couple, both red hair, that's how I knew they were Scottish, who are saying, I think we've got it this time, and I'm going, oh my God, no, don't say that, we've got 2 minutes to go, they're going to score. they scored, so, and there you go. So there is a mindset which I think we need to shake in Scotland, and it's a mindset of valiant underdog.
So how about some of the historic grievances? I mean, we're here in Govan, the shortage of social housing in Scotland. Would something substantial have been done on this?
If there's one thing which Scotland gains from almost immediately, it's escaping the mad British housing market. So remember, the British housing market's run for London, and nowadays actually for Manchester and to some extent the home counties and various places as well. Every time Britain gets a financial crisis, they shore it up by inflating housing prices. It's the go-to for making it look like Britain isn't bankrupt. And take that away. That's not what Scotland needs. We don't need constantly inflated house prices. We don't need constantly inflated land prices. So these are the sorts of things where the economics of Britain start to fade quickly.
Now, inevitably, you had a lot to say about our show last week, so here are just some of the comments you so kindly sent in.
Don Ray J says, Robin McAlpine is one of my favourite independent supporters. This was excellent. Please invite him back often. Veronica says, thank you, Robin. 'Twas music to my ears. Harold says, if only our politicians were as astute and committed as Robin McAlpine, we'd have won the 2014 vote and be totally free of all the chaos thereafter. Angelina McLeod says, another brilliant episode. I always look forward to Alex's interviews with Robin McAlpine. Two wise heads. And finally, Fergie says, interesting look at what could have been and still could be if Scots can shake off that colonised mindset enough to take the first step.
Thank you so much for your tweets, messages and emails. Please do keep them coming in. And now we turn to today's show, part 4 in our series on Scotland as an independent country, where Alex is now interviewing the most wonderful Joan McAlpine.
So John McAlpine, the subject for this interview is Scotland International. And the background is Scotland votes for independence in 2014. Negotiations with the rest of the UK are settled by the end of 2016 and then thrown into doubt again by the rest of the UK exiting the European Union. But then that's settled because we've got 500 million people behind us. So that's the context of this discussion. That's the context of the what if. So what would our relations have been like with the rest of the world? Let's start with our nearest and dearest, the rest of the UK. Would it have been a good relationship after the deal was done, or would there still have been problems?
I think undoubtedly it would have been a good relationship. I mean, you signed the Edinburgh Agreement with David Cameron and they vowed to respect the outcome of the referendum. So I think if they hadn't respected the outcome, not only would they have broken the Edinburgh Agreement, but they would have looked like a bit of a pariah internationally for not respecting democracy. So I think probably once the vote was settled, they would have had to make it work. And if you look at other countries that have become independent in the last 40 years, you tend to find that it's their nearest neighbours that do most to facilitate them joining the international community. So for example, when Slovenia became independent back in 1991, in very different circumstances of course to Scotland would have become independent, it was Germany that promoted Slovenia, made sure that the UN recognised the new country very quickly. And so it's good to be good neighbours. It benefits you both, I think.
But wouldn't that have been subject if that deal was just settled and then all of a sudden everything's back in the melting pot because of Brexit for the rest of the UK? So would that have kind of reopened negotiations? Would that have caused friction? I mean, what would Scotland, maybe would there have been a pro-Brexit movement in independent Scotland in that context?
Well, I think inevitably, you know, there would be. We know that there was a minority of people who were pro-Brexit in Scotland. So, you know, part of being independent is that you have a multifarious voices, but you get the one that is that's dominant in the country. I think that obviously it would have been possibly more of a problem for the UK, and that we saw the way that they had to negotiate the Northern Ireland Protocol, and my committee spent a lot of time looking at that. So they came up with a solution for Northern Ireland, and the EU was very, very clear about that, and Scotland would have benefited in the same way from a similar protocol if we had decided to stay with the European Union, which I have absolutely no doubt that we would have.
So you're talking like, well, what shall we call it, a Balmoral Castle agreement instead of the Windsor Palace Agreement, yeah, the Windsor House Agreement, yeah. So, and that would be what would have been roughly the same thing. Scotland would be in the single market, of course, part of the European Union, but a preferential trading relationship with England and Wales.
Yeah, I think you see what happened with Northern Ireland is that there are pragmatic solutions. And one of the things that I came across very, very strongly when we were with the committee, and we did travel quite a bit to Brussels, and we spoke to Michael Barnier. I remember giving him a book on Scottish mountains. He's a keen mountaineer, he was very pleased. What I noticed is there was a huge amount of goodwill towards Scotland from not just the EU officials but the other countries that we met. So we met officials from Ireland, for example, and there was a lot of goodwill towards us, but they were always very, very clear that as long as you're part of the UK, I'm sorry, we love you to bits, but we can only negotiate with the UK. Whereas when it came to Ireland, Ireland was a member of the EU and they were going to fight for Ireland. Ireland was part of their union. So if Scotland had positioned itself as, say, a continuing member of the EU, we would have been in the same position and we would have benefited from that, the real loyalty of being part of the union.
So let's step outside our scenario for a second and just think of the relative merits for Scotland as we are now between the European Union on the one hand and the European Free Trade Association on the other. Now, from your experience on the International Committee, did you ever think about these comparisons and what might be the advantages of one as opposed to the other?
Well, we did look at it, but we looked at it in the context of Scotland voting against Brexit and remaining a part of the UK, which was for Brexit. And we looked at it in the context of, did EFTA offer another solution for Scotland? Because there are countries around the European Union that have unusual relationships. They're kind of like, yeah, they've negotiated their own relationships with the EU. And so we did look at whether EFTA might be a solution, because our committee did recommend a bespoke solution for Scotland, and then of course everything became really polarised and nobody would support it, particularly when Labour went over towards Brexit.
So you were chairing the committee immediately after Brexit,
yeah.
So a lot of your time, maybe all of your time, was consumed by the issue.
Up until the pandemic struck, a large part of our time was consumed with Brexit. And initially it went really well in that we actually had quite a lot of consensus agreement that Scotland could have a bespoke solution, and we spoke to countries like the Faroe Islands and others that would have had a bespoke relationship with the EU, but obviously that didn't happen. So the scenario that we're talking about here is an independent Scotland. It's a continuing member of the EU. England's voted to leave. We didn't come across any examples of countries that were in the EU that wanted to join EFTA, let's put it that way. EFTA was seen as a stepping stone to the EU, but for obviously some of the Nordic countries, and particularly countries with rich fishing grounds, that was really important because they could negotiate to protect their fishing grounds, and obviously that's an issue for Scotland as well. So from the fishing community's point of view, it might have been attractive. However, most of the people we spoke to said that they had to follow the rules of the EU almost, to the letter, and they had to follow the rules of the EFTA court, which more or less shadowed the rules of the judgments of the European court. So they didn't think it was a particularly easy arrangement. It was fine in the sense that it protected fishing rights, but that was probably the only thing to be said for it, really.
So let's get back to our scenario. We've got the Balmoral Castle Agreement, the Scottish substitute for the Windsor House Agreement in Northern Ireland. And that, of course, confirms trade, but not totally unbridled trade with the rest of the UK, as would be then. But what other consequences would that have? With Scotland in the European Union, Northern Ireland, of course, in the single market, Ireland in the European Union, and then this bit of Brexit in England and Wales.
I think it would have been really advantageous for Scotland. I mean, one of the surprising sectors that we spoke to that were really worried about Brexit was the financial services sector. So in the City of London, there was, real concern that the City of London was going to lose its preeminence as a financial services sector. And of course, Edinburgh being the second financial services sector outside London, and obviously Glasgow being an important financial services sector, there have been huge opportunities for financial services that could have a relationship with the UK and also with the EU, and it would have made it very attractive not just to EU businesses but to businesses from elsewhere in the world, like North America, that wanted access to EU markets. And that's not just in financial services but in other areas as well, that you could, if you wanted a base in Europe, you would go and locate yourself in an English-speaking country with fantastic infrastructure and obviously an amazing global brand as well.
So, well, let's say there's this mass influx of English financial companies into this city of Glasgow. If all these merchant bankers end up in the merchant city, aren't the Glaswegians going to say, wait a minute, all we want's a house?
Well, I think that's our new independent Scottish government would be building people houses, which is obviously not, it's like we're facing a housing crisis across the UK at the moment. I think the thing about financial services that we know is that a large part of the tax take comes from financial services, and so we'd be able to raise a great deal more money, and so these people coming in would have a tax benefit that we can then invest in public services. So I don't see a downside to it.
So we've got Scotland secure in the European Union, we've done the deal, the Balmoral Castle Agreement, and we're making our own way in Europe. Well, let's talk about, would we have an influence over European Union policy? I mean, can you think of examples where we might have led the way, or at least pointed the way on anything?
Well, I think in terms of our renewable energy, and we're recognised as a renewable energy hub, I think that would have definitely influenced, we would have had an influence in Europe in that regard, yeah. In other environmental areas, definitely. So
how about beyond Europe? How about the rest of the world? I mean, where was Scotland, this new country, quite an unusual new country in the sense it would be a liberal Western European democracy becoming an independent country? That hasn't happened too often in recent years, so it would be quite an interesting country for people. But how would we stand with the rest of the world?
I think as soon as we voted democratically to become an independent country, there wouldn't be any problem at all in being recognised. I mentioned earlier Slovenia was immediately recognised, but there's lots of other countries like Croatia, Montenegro, that have been recognised very quickly by the international community within 12 months, and in not always the same democratic circumstances that we're envisaging for Scotland. So I think there would be a lot of goodwill. I think Scotland, obviously, even without being an independent country, Scotland has an incredible brand. Everybody knows what Scotland is. They've seen it portrayed visually in art and culture and films. They know about whisky, they know about our scenery. We've got the most amazing brand identity that's already, as a non-independent country, been identified in the International Brand Index. And so we have incredible strengths, and of course our diaspora, being part of the UK, we sent a lot of people around the world. Scots travelled to North America and all around the world, and there is that connection with the diaspora, particularly in North America, that I think would cause a lot of excitement. But I think just the idea of Scotland, a place that everyone kind of feels they know, people already feel warm towards as being this new country. I think there would be incredible goodwill towards us. Think about the goodwill that there was towards the Czech Republic, for example. Everybody was going in there on their holidays almost as soon as it became independent. I think it would be a similar thing. I think we would have an enormous psychological boost internally, but also incredible resonance internationally.
And would you have advocated policies like when one stage in Ireland, they were joint citizenship with as many of the Irish diaspora as they could possibly manage? Would that be a policy you would think would be worth considering?
I think that was a good idea, and I think Estonia have a similar policy as well. I think Estonia, I remember taking evidence from the Estonian ambassador, and they had a digital passport. So yeah, I think obviously nations and nationhood changes, and we're living in an increasingly connected global world, and I think your brand and your values and what you represent culturally becomes ever more important, almost more important than borders. And maybe that's the upside in us. If we're not independent at the moment, we still have this incredibly resonant international brand that I think that other people would want to be part of. It's like global tribes, if you like, and ours is very positive. So I think there would have been a lot that we could have had a digital Scottish passport, for example, extended it to other places.
And would there be anything in world politics where Scotland might lead the way? I mean, we saw the Uachtaráin Higgins recently make a strong statement about the European Union and the Gaza Strip. Would have been perhaps in issues like the pandemic, would Scotland have been able to take a leading role from its background or its specialism or its orientation in the world?
Well, it's difficult to say. How we responded to the pandemic when it happened wasn't really that different to how the UK responded to the pandemic. So I don't think that, I don't think we can really congratulate ourselves there. And
indeed, but then, they would be very difficult to respond in a different way when you were dependent entirely on whatever the approach the Treasury was taking. I was thinking more that, if you think back to the swine flu pandemic, or almost pandemic, the pandemic that never was, at that stage, the Scottish Health Service was the one supplying data to the World Health Organisation as to what this pandemic was. Now, we seem to have lost a great deal of that advantage we had from our command health service. Would we have got it back again?
Well, I would have hoped that, I believe that independence would have resulted in greater prosperity, and the health service, particularly in the latter months of the independence referendum, there was a huge focus on the health service and investment in the health service. So I would have hoped that if we had voted for independence, that would have continued. And of course, one of the things that we do have in Scotland is some of the world's oldest universities. Wow. And the research facilities and some of the innovation that we have pioneered historically and continue pioneering in our universities, and I think that we would have been recognised as a global leader for that.
So John McAlpine, in this series we've been looking at what the changes would have been in Scotland. I think perhaps the last question would be, 10 years after independence, what would the rest of the world, the international community, think of this 10-year-old, this ancient nation, but a 10-year-old independent state?
I think they would have a great deal of goodwill towards us, and they would probably see us as an example of courage, that if you believe in yourselves, you can make change, and you can make change in a peaceful way. And I think we'd be quite an inspiration to the world, even if we didn't get everything right. I think they would see us as an inspiring place.
Well, as an inspiring place, that's a great way to end our series. And what if Scotland had voted for independence 10 years ago? Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Water is life, but not all water is equal. Our water ionizer restructures and alkalizes water for optimum hydration and detoxification, recreating the planet's ultimate water sources, found in lightning-struck lakes and newly melted icebergs. H2 Pure Source. Change your water. Change your life.
So what we learned over these 4 programmes of what Scotland might have looked like if we'd voted for independence 10 years ago. Well, on the economy with Dr. Jim Walker, well, I think we can agree that Scotland would not have been a land of milk and honey, but it would have been a land of oil, gas and renewables, which would have stood us in good stead as we made our way as an independent country. With Bernard Ponsonby in the politics, I think undoubtedly Bernard Ponsonby was correct to say that independence would have brought about more political parties and more choice, because in a proportional system in most normal independent countries you have a whole variety of parties. That wouldn't have been a bad thing. In terms of Robin McAlpine and the social life of Scotland, then I think certain issues would have been tackled head on. The issue of housing, for example. But Robin was correct to point to the fact that there would have been social tensions in a new Scotland, but perhaps with the powers to overcome these would have been in a much, much better position. And finally, Joan McAlpine on the international aspects. I think we can be certain that Scotland would have been integrated in Europe, either part of the European Union or, as I would prefer, part of the European Free Trade Association, EFTA, but certainly a much more European inclined country, and therefore one with a much more certain view of the world than perhaps Britain has at the present moment. I mean, Britain has gone for Brexit but hasn't found a role. Scotland would have had a defined role as a small, independent, prosperous Western European country. I hope also we'd have had that bit more time to try and pay some attention to those in the world who have nothing at all and those who are suffering from manifest injustice. All in all, Scotland as an independent country would not have been a paradise on earth, but nonetheless you can see discernibly on the economy and the social life and the political system a Scotland which was able to tackle its own problems, ring its own till and find its own way in the world. Not, given the desultory 10 years that we've had, too bad a prospect at all. I just wish we'd voted for independence 10 years ago.
And with that, sadly we come to the end of this week's show and the final part in our series on what Scotland would have looked like had we voted yes in 2014. But do not worry, because we're keeping the conversation and the topic going over the next couple of weeks. We're going to play out our recording of The Eyes Still Have It from the IMAX cinema in Glasgow, and you'll get the opportunity to watch Bernard Ponsonby, Philippa Whitford, Joanna Cherry, Michelle Thompson, Alec Neil, Fergus Ewing, Wings Over Scotland and many more. So much to look forward to. So keep tuned and we'll see you, different place but same time, next week at 10 o'clock. Until then, take care.
This is an exciting time in Scotland's story, and understanding our past will help us determine our future. And when Scotland's voice is heard, it charts the way forward. This is Scotland Speaks with Alex Salmond.